In February 1912, 6-year-old Puyi lost the largest empire in Chinese history, but not his throne, servants, ceremonies, or palace. Beyond the Forbidden City's walls, China became a republic. Inside, the Qing court continued acting as though the dynasty had never disappeared. This documentary follows the imperial family from that strange existence behind the palace walls, through expulsion, Japanese manipulation, revolution, imprisonment, and eventual life as ordinary citizens. 1. The abdication that allowed the court to survive. Why Yuan Shikai avoided immediately abolishing the imperial household. On February 12, 1912, Empress Dowager Longyu signed the abdication edict on behalf of the 6-year-old emperor, Puyi. More than 2 centuries of Qing rule officially ended, yet the imperial household was not dismantled. Puyi retained his title, continued living inside the Forbidden City, and remained surrounded by relatives, tutors, guards, eunuchs, and officials. This strange arrangement was not simply an act of mercy toward a child. It was the result of a carefully negotiated political settlement designed to end a revolution before China descended into a prolonged civil war. Yuan Shikai stood at the center of that settlement. As commander of the powerful Beiyang army, he controlled the military force most capable of either defending the Qing government or forcing it to surrender. The revolutionaries who had established a provisional republic in southern China possessed political momentum, but they lacked the strength to defeat Yuan's northern armies quickly. At the same time, the Qing court could no longer govern the country without his support. Yuan therefore became the indispensable intermediary between the imperial family and the revolutionary leadership. An immediate and humiliating destruction of the imperial household could have provoked resistance from Qing loyalists. Many military officers, provincial officials, Manchu nobles, and conservative elites still regarded the dynasty as a legitimate institution, even if they accepted that reform was unavoidable. Yuan understood that removing every title, privilege, and residence at once might transform a negotiated transition into a loyalist rebellion. Preserving the court inside the Forbidden City allowed those groups to accept the republic without feeling that the old order had been completely dishonored. The problem extended beyond Beijing. The Qing emperor was connected symbolically to Mongolia, Tibet, Xinjiang, and other regions, whose relationships with the central government had been shaped by the dynasty rather than by Chinese republican nationalism. Revolutionary leaders feared that the sudden destruction of the throne could encourage separatism or political fragmentation. The abdication edict therefore declared that sovereignty over the empire's territories would pass to the new republic. Allowing the imperial family to retain ceremonial dignity helped present the transition as a transfer of authority rather than the collapse of the entire state. Yuan also wanted to prevent foreign governments from using instability as an excuse to intervene. Britain, Russia, Japan, France, Germany, and other powers possessed commercial privileges, military interests, and spheres of influence within China. A long conflict between imperial and republican forces could have invited deeper foreign interference or even the division of Chinese territory. A negotiated abdication offered the appearance of legal continuity, reassuring foreign diplomats that existing treaties, debts, and economic arrangements would not suddenly disappear with the dynasty. The revolutionaries accepted the compromise because they needed Yuan to secure the emperor's abdication. Sun Yat-sen had become provisional president of the republic, but he agreed to surrender that position if Yuan delivered a peaceful transfer of power. Yuan could then present himself to the Qing court as the man protecting it from revolutionary vengeance, while telling the revolutionaries that only he could end imperial rule without a northern war. Every side believed it was using him, but Yuan emerged with the presidency and command of China's strongest army. The imperial family's protections were formalized in the Articles of Favorable Treatment. Puyi would continue to be addressed by his imperial title within the palace, and the Republic promised to treat him with the ceremonial status granted to a foreign monarch. The household was allowed to remain temporarily in the Forbidden City and was promised a large annual subsidy. Imperial temples and ancestral tombs would also receive protection. These concessions created an extraordinary arrangement. The monarchy had disappeared from China's government, but a miniature version of the Qing court survived inside the capital. Money and property made immediate abolition even more difficult. The Forbidden City contained palaces, archives, religious objects, artworks, jewels, and collections accumulated across generations. There was no clear boundary between property belonging personally to the imperial household and property belonging to the Chinese state. Forcing an immediate settlement could have produced chaos, theft, and conflict over priceless possessions. By postponing the question, Yuan avoided an explosive dispute, although the delay later allowed corruption and the removal of numerous objects from the palace collections. Yuan's decision was also shaped by his own complicated relationship with monarchy. He did not act as a committed defender of democratic government. His priority was the concentration of political and military authority under his leadership. Preserving the imperial household gave him a useful symbol that could reassure conservatives while he weakened republican institutions. His later attempt to proclaim himself emperor in 1915 suggests that he never regarded monarchy itself as unthinkable, although that later ambition should not be treated as the sole reason for the 1912 agreement. The compromise ended the Qing dynasty without resolving what would happen to the people who had embodied it. Yuan gained the presidency, the revolutionaries gained a republic, and the imperial family gained protection. But none of these arrangements proved secure. China entered an era of political fragmentation. Yuan's monarchical experiment failed, and the court remained suspended between its vanished authority and its surviving privileges. For 12 more years, Puyi would live behind the red walls of the Forbidden City as an emperor in ceremony, a private citizen under republican law, and a potential instrument for anyone hoping to restore the old order. 2. A lost dynasty. Behind closed gates, corruption, disappearing treasures, and the declining imperial fortune. Behind the gates of the Forbidden City, the Qing court continued to display the rituals of an empire that no longer existed. Puyi still occupied imperial halls, received formal bows, issued instructions to household officials, and lived among objects collected by generations of emperors. Yet beneath this appearance of continuity, the court's financial foundations were deteriorating. The dynasty had lost its tax system, provincial revenues, and control over the state treasury. What remained was an expensive palace household attempting to maintain imperial traditions with uncertain payments from a fragile republic. Under the Articles of Favorable Treatment, the Republican government had promised the imperial household an annual allowance of 4 million silver dollars. In practice, China's unstable political conditions made regular payment difficult. Governments changed, military factions competed for Beijing, and national revenue was consumed by debts and armed conflict. Payments were frequently delayed, reduced, or disputed. The court could no longer assume that the money promised in 1912 would arrive on time, but its enormous network of relatives, servants, guards, officials, ceremonies, kitchens, and residences continued to demand funding. The imperial household possessed valuable estates, investments, precious metals, jewels, artworks, and personal collections, but its finances were poorly organized. Different palace departments maintained separate accounts, while officials often resisted outside inspection. The distinction between property belonging to the former emperor and property belonging to the Chinese state remained unclear. This ambiguity allowed almost anyone with access to the inner palace to claim that a valuable object was a private possession, an imperial gift, or an item intended for official use. Effective supervision was nearly impossible. Corruption had existed inside the palace long before the fall of the dynasty, but the disappearance of central authority made it more difficult to control. Eunuchs and household officials managed storerooms, purchases, transportation, and access to restricted buildings. Some inflated expenses, collected unofficial payments, or removed objects that could be sold beyond the palace walls. Not every servant participated, and later accusations were sometimes exaggerated. But surviving inventories and investigations indicate that significant quantities of imperial property disappeared during this period. The market beyond the Forbidden City made the theft of palace objects especially profitable. Beijing contained antique dealers, collectors, intermediaries, and foreign buyers eager to obtain ceramics, paintings, jade, books, and objects associated with the Qing emperors. Once an item left the palace, its history could be disguised or replaced with a convenient explanation. Some treasures entered private Chinese collections, while others passed through international trading networks. The former imperial court was therefore losing not only money, but also pieces of China's cultural inheritance. Responsibility did not belong exclusively to palace servants. Members of the imperial clan also received gifts, transferred objects between residences, borrowed against valuable possessions, or sold items to support their lifestyles. Puyi himself later arranged for selected paintings, calligraphy, and rare books to be carried out through his younger brother Puyi. The objects were officially recorded as imperial rewards, but many were being removed because Puyi feared that the Republican government might eventually seize the palace and everything inside it. Protection, private ownership, and appropriation became difficult to separate. By the early 1920s, Puyi had begun to suspect that the household surrounding him was consuming his remaining fortune. Encouraged by his tutors and reform-minded advisors, he demanded inventories and attempted to examine palace expenses. These efforts threatened officials whose positions depended on secrecy. Records were incomplete, rooms remained locked, and explanations changed whenever missing objects were discovered. Puyi was still a teenager with limited knowledge of administration, making him dependent on the same people he was attempting to investigate. In June 1923, a major fire destroyed part of the Jianfu Palace complex, an area containing storerooms filled with valuable objects. Rumors quickly suggested that the fire had been started to conceal theft, particularly because an inventory had been planned. That suspicion became part of the enduring story of corruption inside the Forbidden City, but direct proof of deliberate arson remains uncertain. Whatever its cause, the fire convinced Puyi that the old palace administration could no longer be trusted and accelerated his campaign against the eunuchs. Soon afterward, Puyi ordered most of the eunuchs expelled from the Forbidden City. Their departure ended a system of palace service that had existed for centuries, but it did not recover the missing treasures or solve the court's financial problems. Many records had already vanished, and countless objects could no longer be traced. The dismissal also disrupted the daily operation of the palace because the eunuchs had preserved specialized knowledge about ceremonies, buildings, collections, and household routines. Removing a corruptible institution was easier than replacing everything it had managed. When Puyi was expelled from the Forbidden City in 1924, Republican authorities began a systematic examination of the palace collections. Their work revealed both the extraordinary scale of what remained and the serious gaps left by years of disorder, private transfers, sales, and theft. The declining imperial fortune had exposed the central contradiction of Puyi's protected existence. He possessed the appearance of unlimited wealth, but lacked a stable government capable of protecting it. Behind the closed gates, The Qing court had not remained frozen in time. It had been slowly consuming, scattering, and losing the physical inheritance of the empire it could no longer rule. 3. The 12-day return of the emperor. Why Zhang Xun attempted to restore the Qing dynasty. In the early hours of July 1, 1917, imperial flags appeared above Beijing once again. 11-year-old Puyi was awakened inside the Forbidden City and informed that he had been restored as Emperor of China. Officials recovered their former titles, monarchist edicts were issued, and the Republican calendar was temporarily replaced by the Qing reign system. The restoration seemed sudden, but it emerged from years of political fragmentation and from one general's conviction that the Republic had failed. That general was Zhang Xun, a veteran military commander who had remained openly loyal to the Qing dynasty after the 1911 revolution. While many former imperial officers adapted quickly to the Republic, Zhang preserved the symbols of the old order. He and his troops famously continued wearing the traditional Q hairstyle associated with Qing rule, earning them the nickname Q Army. To Zhang, loyalty to the deposed dynasty was not merely ceremonial. It formed the foundation of his political identity and distinguished him from rival commanders. The first years of the Republic appeared to confirm many conservative fears. Political parties struggled to establish stable institutions, military leaders ignored civilian authority, and provincial armies increasingly followed their commanders rather than the central government. Yuan Shikai dissolved parliament, concentrated power in his own hands, and later attempted to create a new monarchy with himself as emperor. When Yuan died in 1916, he left no strong political system capable of controlling the military factions that had grown under his leadership. For Zhang, this disorder demonstrated that republican government was unsuitable for China. He believed the emperor could stand above competing parties and regional commanders, providing a single source of legitimacy. This was an idealized vision of the Qing monarchy, overlooking the crises that had brought the dynasty down. Nevertheless, monarchists argued that restoring Puyi would reconnect political authority with Confucian traditions, calm conservative elites, and prevent the country from breaking apart under warlord rule. The immediate opportunity came from a confrontation between President Li Yuanhong and Premier Duan Qirui. Their dispute centered partly on whether China should enter the First World War against Germany, but it also reflected a deeper struggle over military and constitutional power. Li dismissed Duan in May 1917, provoking opposition from military governors allied with the former premier. With the government close to paralysis, Zhang offered to mediate and marched his forces into Beijing, supposedly to resolve the crisis. Once his troops controlled the capital, Zhang revealed that mediation had never been his only objective. He believed the conflict between Li and Duan had discredited the Republic so thoroughly that political leaders would accept a monarchist solution. Some conservative politicians and former Qing officials encouraged this conclusion, while others allowed Zhang to proceed because they hoped to benefit from the confusion. The monarchist scholar Kang Yue also participated, viewing restoration as a possible path toward a constitutional monarchy rather than a complete return to the old imperial system. Zhang may also have misunderstood the intentions of other military commanders. During private discussions, several appeared sympathetic to monarchy or deliberately avoided giving him a clear answer. Their ambiguity allowed Zhang to imagine a broad coalition that did not actually exist. Some wanted him to weaken President Li, while others expected his restoration attempt to fail and create an opportunity for them to intervene. Zhang entered Beijing believing he had silent support, but much of that support disappeared as soon as he proclaimed the emperor's return. Puyi himself had little control over the event. He was a child living in political isolation, surrounded by former imperial officials who presented restoration as the recovery of his rightful position. The Qing court accepted Zhang's plan, distributed titles, and issued decrees in Puyi's name. Yet the restored government possessed no national administration, reliable treasury, or broad military alliance. Its authority extended little beyond the capital and depended almost entirely on Zhang's troops. The restoration immediately united many of Zhang's rivals against him. Duan Qirui presented himself as the defender of the republic and assembled military forces outside Beijing. Provincial leaders who had shown monarchist sympathies refused to recognize Puyi, while foreign governments withheld support. Even many conservatives concluded that Zhang's attempt was poorly planned. Within days, the restored court found itself politically isolated, revealing that dissatisfaction with the republic did not automatically translate into support for the Qing dynasty. On July 12th, Republican forces entered Beijing and ended the restoration after approximately 12 days. Zhang sought protection in a foreign diplomatic compound, while Puyi lost the throne for a second time, but remained inside the Forbidden City under the earlier arrangement. The episode exposed how the imperial family could still be used as a political instrument, even without real authority. Zhang had attempted to revive the Qing dynasty because he believed monarchy could restore unity, but his failure demonstrated that the old throne no longer possessed the power to command China's competing armies, politicians, and provinces. 4. The day the Forbidden City was taken away. How the palace became the Palace Museum in 1925. When Puyi was forced to leave the Forbidden City on November 5, 1924, the palace ceased to be an imperial residence for the first time in nearly 5 centuries. Soldiers entered spaces that had remained under the control of the Qing household even after the dynasty's abdication. Puyi, his empress Wanrong, his consort Wengxiu, and members of the household were given only a short period to gather their belongings. Once they departed, the question was no longer whether the monarchy could survive inside the palace, but who owned the buildings and everything they contained. The transformation had actually begun before Puyi's expulsion. After the 1912 abdication, the Forbidden City had been divided between 2 very different worlds. Puyi and the imperial household retained the inner court, where the emperors and their families had traditionally lived. The Republican government controlled the outer court, the ceremonial heart of the former empire. In 1914, part of this area was opened as the Museum of Antiquities, displaying objects transferred from imperial collections at other former royal residences. The arrangement remained incomplete because the most private sections of the Forbidden City were still inaccessible. Behind locked gates stood residential halls, temples, storerooms, libraries, workshops, and chambers filled with objects accumulated under the Ming and Qing dynasties. Republican officials had little reliable information about what remained there. Years of theft, private sales, undocumented imperial gifts, and transfers between palace residences had made it almost impossible to distinguish the original collections from what had disappeared. Following the expulsion, the new authorities established the Committee for the Disposition of Qing Imperial Possessions. Its members included government representatives, scholars, and public figures, who were assigned to inspect the palace and determine the status of its contents. They sealed storerooms, restricted access, examined surviving records, and began the enormous task of cataloging objects room by room. The committee's work was not only administrative, it represented the transfer of cultural authority from an imperial family to a republican institution. The inventory revealed the astonishing scale of the collections. Officials encountered paintings, calligraphy, ceramics, bronzes, jade, clocks, furniture, weapons, seals, religious objects, court documents, garments, books, and everyday possessions used by generations of emperors. The palace was not simply a group of historic buildings, it was an archive of government, ritual, art, diplomacy, family life, and craftsmanship extending across centuries. Cataloging these materials required experts capable of identifying objects whose documentation had been lost or deliberately altered. Ownership remained deeply controversial. Puyi and his supporters argued that many objects were the private property of the imperial household, and that their seizure violated the guarantees made in 1912. Republican officials responded that the palace and its major collections had been maintained through state revenue and therefore belonged to the nation. There was no simple legal boundary between personal possessions and government property, because imperial rule had never clearly separated the emperor's household from the state itself. Some politicians proposed selling valuable objects to raise money for the financially weakened government. Others feared that military commanders or corrupt officials would divide the collections among themselves. Scholars and preservation advocates argued that public access offered the best protection. If the palace became a museum, its contents could be documented, studied, and displayed instead of disappearing into private collections. Opening the gates would make it more difficult for any single faction to claim the treasures in secret. The committee therefore prepared the inner court for public exhibition. Rooms had to be inspected, collections organized, entrances controlled, and visitor routes created without destroying the palace's historical arrangement. This process changed the meaning of the buildings. The throne halls were no longer stages on which imperial authority was performed. They became evidence through which citizens could examine how the former dynasty had governed, worshipped, celebrated, and lived behind walls that had once excluded almost everyone. On October 10, 1925, the anniversary of the revolution that had overthrown the Qing dynasty, the Palace Museum officially opened. Large crowds entered the Forbidden City to see spaces previously reserved for emperors, relatives, officials, and palace servants. Ordinary visitors could now stand before the thrones, examine imperial artworks, and walk through courtyards that had symbolized inaccessible authority. The selection of National Day for the opening transformed the museum into a public statement. The palace was no longer the private center of a ruling house. The creation of the Palace Museum did not immediately end disputes over ownership, corruption, or preservation. China's political instability continued to threaten the collections, and later, conflicts would force thousands of objects to be evacuated from Beijing for protection. Nevertheless, the opening in 1925 produced an irreversible transformation. The Forbidden City had survived the fall of the Qing, the 1917 restoration, and Puyi's protected court. It now belonged to a different historical order, preserved not as the home of a living emperor, but as a national institution dedicated to the civilization his dynasty had left behind. 5. Exile in Tianjin and the Japanese invitation divisions within the Aisin-Gioro family over Japan. After his expulsion from the Forbidden City, Puyi briefly stayed at the residence of his father, Zaifeng, before seeking protection at the Japanese legation in Beijing. In 1925, he moved to Tianjin, where foreign concessions operated beyond the complete authority of the Chinese government. Puyi lived first in Zhang Garden and later in the residence known as the Quiet Garden. Surrounded by former Qing officials, foreign diplomats, monarchists, and Japanese agents, he began planning how the dynasty might be restored. Within the Aisin-Gioro family, however, there was no agreement that Japan should become the instrument of that restoration. Puyi increasingly regarded Japan as the only power capable of returning him to political authority. Chinese military leaders had used or abandoned him. Republican officials had removed him from the Forbidden City, and the nationalist movement rejected any revival of hereditary rule. Japan, by contrast, treated him with elaborate respect and permitted his household to preserve imperial ceremonies in Tianjin. Japanese representatives understood that recognition was one of their strongest methods of influence. By continuing to address Puyi as emperor, they strengthened his belief that cooperation could transform his title into real power. His father, Zaifeng, viewed the situation more cautiously. Zaifeng had served as regent during the final years of the Qing Dynasty and had already experienced the dangers of governing amid military pressure and foreign interference. He reportedly warned Puyi against trusting Japanese promises, recognizing that a throne created by another empire would not be independent. Zaifeng did not become a Republican enthusiast, but he preferred private survival to a restoration controlled from Tokyo. His caution placed him in direct opposition to the ambitions developing around his son. Other members of the extended clan believed cooperation with Japan might protect Manchu interests. The fall of the Qing had cost imperial relatives their official positions, government payments, political influence, and access to many former properties. Some hoped that a restored court in Manchuria would recover at least part of their status. Monarchist princes such as Puyi openly supported restoration projects and cultivated Japanese connections. Yet personal rivalry complicated their loyalty because different branches of the Aisin-Gioro family had their own claims, ambitions, and expectations about who would receive power. Puyi's younger brother Puyi occupied an especially important position. As Puyi had no children, Puyi could become central to the dynasty's future succession. His later education in Japan, military training, and marriage to the Japanese noblewoman Hiro Saga tied him closely to Japanese plans for the imperial household. The marriage was presented as a union between distinguished families, but it also allowed Japanese officials to influence the Qing bloodline. Puyi's position demonstrated how private family decisions had become matters of imperial strategy. The women of Puyi's household also reacted differently to his political ambitions. Empress Wanrong accompanied him to Tianjin and later to Manchuria, but her ceremonial position offered little influence over Japanese decision-making. Consort Wenxiu became increasingly dissatisfied with palace restrictions and with Puyi's direction. In 1931, she obtained a divorce, an unprecedented humiliation for the former emperor. Political disagreement was not the only cause, but her departure exposed the growing instability inside a household that still demanded imperial obedience while possessing no secure empire. Many relatives understood that association with Japan carried serious risks. Chinese public opinion increasingly viewed Japanese expansion as a threat, particularly after Japan strengthened its position in Manchuria. A Japanese-sponsored restoration could cause the Aisin-Gioro family to be remembered not as victims of revolution, but as partners of a foreign occupying power. Some relatives therefore kept their distance, adopted ordinary professions, or attempted to live quietly under the Republic. For them, preserving the family required abandoning the dream of recovering the throne. The division became urgent after the Mukden incident of September 1931, when the Japanese army rapidly expanded its control over Manchuria. Japanese officer Kenji Doihara and other agents encouraged Puyi to leave Tianjin, promising that Manchuria would become the foundation of a restored political order. Advisors around Puyi disagreed over whether this was a historic opportunity or a trap. Those favoring cooperation emphasized ancestral connections to the region, while opponents warned that the Japanese military, not the Aisin-Gioro family, would determine the new state's policies. Puyi ultimately accepted the Japanese invitation because his desire for restoration outweighed the warnings from his relatives. His decision did not reunite the dynasty. It carried its divisions into Manchukuo. Some family members joined the new court, others participated reluctantly, and several remained distant from the project. The conflict within the Aisin-Gioro clan was therefore larger than a disagreement about Japan. It was a struggle over what survival meant after the loss of an empire. Recovering titles through foreign power, preserving the family without political authority, or accepting that the Qing dynasty had become history. 6. Manchukuo, a crown controlled by another empire. The difference between imperial ceremony and real political authority. When Puyi arrived in Manchuria, he expected Japan to restore the Qing dynasty. Instead, Japanese officials created a new state designed around their own strategic interests. In March 1932, Puyi became chief executive of Manchukuo, receiving the title of Datong rather than emperor. Only in 1934 was he placed on a throne under the reign name Kangde. He had recovered imperial ceremony, but the empire he imagined and the state Japan constructed were fundamentally different. The coronation revealed this contradiction. Puyi wished to present himself as the heir of the Qing emperors, wearing traditional dragon robes and honoring his Manchu ancestors. Japanese authorities wanted him to appear as the modern ruler of a new multi-ethnic state, aligned with Tokyo. Puyi privately performed a traditional ceremony in imperial clothing before participating in the official event, dressed in a military-style uniform. Even on the day of his coronation, he could control the symbolism of his throne only within limits established by Japan. Officially, Manchukuo possessed the institutions of an independent country. It had ministries, courts, a central bank, armed forces, diplomatic representatives, a flag, an anthem, and a capital at sinking. Present-day Changchun. Government propaganda described it as a harmonious state for Manchus, Han Chinese, Mongols, Koreans, and Japanese. Puyi signed laws, received ambassadors, conducted ceremonies, and appeared at official events. These institutions created the visible architecture of sovereignty without giving him control over its foundations. Real power rested with the Japanese Kwantung Army. Its commanders supervised Manchukuo's security, foreign relations, senior appointments, and strategic policies. Japanese advisors were placed throughout the administration, frequently serving beside local ministers, whose authority existed mostly on paper. Major decisions could not proceed without Japanese approval. Puyi might receive a completed document for his signature, but the policy had often been discussed and determined before it reached his desk. The government's personnel system preserved the same imbalance. Chinese and Manchu officials occupied prominent ministerial positions, allowing Japan to claim that Manchukuo governed itself. Behind them stood Japanese vice ministers, bureau chiefs, technical experts, and military representatives who controlled information and implementation. An official who resisted Japanese instructions could be removed or isolated. Puyi himself could propose appointments, but he rarely possessed the independent power to protect loyal officials against the Kwantung Army. Economic authority was equally restricted. Manchuria contained coal, iron, fertile agricultural land, railways, and industrial centers that were essential to Japan's continental ambitions. Japanese institutions, including the South Manchuria Railway Company and major industrial groups, directed much of the region's development. Factories, mines, transportation networks, and financial systems expanded rapidly, but their priorities were closely connected to Japan's military and economic needs. Puyi presided over this transformation without controlling its central strategy. Even his personal court was carefully monitored. Japanese officials supervised access to Puyi, observed his communications, and kept track of the advisors surrounding him. His public journeys were arranged to display loyalty, stability, and cooperation between Manchukuo and Japan. Ceremonies presented him as a sacred ruler, yet his movements and meetings could be restricted. The more elaborate his imperial image became, the more clearly his daily dependence revealed the limits of his position. Internationally, the weakness of Puyi's authority was difficult to conceal. Japan promoted Manchukuo as the result of local independence, but the League of Nations concluded that the new state had been created under Japanese military influence. Most major powers refused to recognize it. Japan responded by leaving the League in 1933. Recognition came primarily from Japan, and governments later aligned with it, leaving Puyi with imperial titles, but little independent diplomatic legitimacy. Puyi had regained a crown, palace ceremonies, uniforms, officials, and public rituals. But none of these guaranteed sovereignty. His value to Japan came precisely from the contrast between appearance and reality. As the final Qing emperor, he gave historical legitimacy to a state controlled by another empire. Manchukuo therefore became the culmination of his restoration dream and the destruction of its original meaning. He was once again an emperor, but the most important decisions made in his name belonged to the Japanese authorities standing behind the throne. 7. The final collapse of the imperial dream. Why the Qing restoration became impossible. After 1945. In August 1945, the political world that had sustained Puyi's Second Empire disappeared within days. The Soviet Union entered the war against Japan and advanced into Manchuria, while Japan announced its surrender to the Allied powers. Without Japanese military protection, Manchukuo's government collapsed almost immediately. Puyi formally renounced his throne, ending an imperial project that had lasted 13 years but had never acquired genuine independence. This time, there would be no protected court, foreign concession, or powerful army waiting to restore him. Japan's defeat removed the only state willing to support Puyi's return to power. During the 1920s, scattered Qing loyalists could still imagine finding assistance from a Chinese military faction or foreign government. By 1945, that possibility had vanished. Japan's sponsorship had not strengthened the Qing claim. It had permanently connected Puyi's restoration campaign with Japanese expansion. Once the Kwantung Army collapsed, the throne of Manchukuo had no independent military, financial, or administrative foundation capable of surviving on its own. Puyi attempted to leave Manchuria, but was captured by Soviet forces at the airport in Mukden, present-day Shenyang. He spent the following years in Soviet custody, separated from the court and officials who had sustained his imperial identity. His detention prevented monarchists from using him as a political symbol during the immediate post-war crisis. More importantly, it demonstrated how little power he possessed without a sponsoring state. The man who had appeared in official propaganda as an emperor had become a prisoner whose future would be decided by foreign governments. The reputation of the Qing restoration had also been severely damaged inside China. Manchukuo was widely regarded as a Japanese-controlled regime established after military occupation. Many Chinese citizens therefore associated Puyi not with national unity, but with foreign intervention. Even people who felt nostalgia for the Qing era could not easily separate the dynasty's final emperor from the state he had governed under Japanese supervision. Restoration would have required overcoming not only Republican opposition, but also the political consequences of collaboration. China's two dominant political forces rejected monarchy completely. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government claimed legitimacy from the Republican Revolution and presented itself as the defender of Chinese sovereignty. The Chinese Communist Party also opposed dynastic rule, describing imperial institutions as part of the social and political order the revolution intended to replace. Although the nationalists and communists fought over China's future, neither side considered returning power to the Aisin-Gioro family. The throne had no place in either competing vision of the nation. The Qing family no longer possessed the institutional network required for restoration. Imperial princes had lost their official positions, palace departments had disappeared, and former bannermen had become ordinary residents of Chinese cities. Some Aisin-Gioro relatives had cooperated with Manchukuo, while others had deliberately distanced themselves from Puyi's project. The clan was divided, geographically scattered, and increasingly integrated into civilian society. It could preserve family connections, but it could no longer operate as a national political organization. The economic foundations of monarchy had also been dismantled. The Forbidden City was now the Palace Museum. Imperial collections had become part of the national heritage, and many former estates had been confiscated, sold, or transferred. The court no longer controlled taxation, land revenues, military forces, or an independent treasury. Restoring the dynasty would therefore have required rebuilding an entire imperial system rather than simply placing Puyi on a throne. No major political movement possessed either the resources or public support for such a project. The international order after the Second World War made another foreign-sponsored monarchy equally unlikely. Japan had lost its empire, European colonial powers were weakened, and movements for national independence were expanding across Asia. A government created around a former emperor by an outside military power would have faced immediate questions of legitimacy. The Soviet Union could use Puyi as a witness or diplomatic asset, but it had no ideological reason to recreate the Qing dynasty. Other Allied powers showed no serious interest in restoring him. In 1950, the Soviet Union transferred Puyi to the newly established People's Republic of China. He entered a re-education center for individuals connected to the former Japanese-sponsored government. When he received a pardon in 1959, he was not restored to ceremonial leadership or allowed to rebuild an imperial court. He returned to Beijing as an ordinary citizen, later working at a botanical garden and as an editor. The new government used his transformation to demonstrate that even a former emperor could be absorbed into revolutionary society. After 1945, the Qing dynasty survived only through its architecture, collections, archives, descendants, and contested memory. Japan's defeat had removed Puyi's military sponsor, while collaboration had destroyed much of his political credibility. Republicans, nationalists, and communists had all built their legitimacy around a China without imperial rule. The imperial dream did not end simply because Puyi lost another throne. It ended because the institutions, wealth, alliances, and social order that could have supported a Qing restoration no longer existed. 8. From imperial clan to ordinary citizens, Puyi's life. After his 1959 pardon, on December 4, 1959, Puyi received a special pardon from the government of the People's Republic of China. He had entered detention as the former ruler of Manchukuo and emerged nearly 10 years later without a palace, title, fortune, or political office. At the age of 53, the man who had twice occupied an imperial throne returned to Beijing as an ordinary citizen. For the first time in his life, he was expected to manage his daily existence without servants or an imperial household organizing everything around him. Puyi initially lived with members of his extended family, many of whom had already adapted to life under the new political system. Former princes, princesses, and aristocratic relatives had become workers, artists, teachers, and public employees. The relationships between them were no longer governed by strict court protocol. Relatives who had once bowed before Puyi could now speak to him as a family member. This change was more than symbolic. The social structure that had placed him above everyone around him had permanently disappeared. The government arranged for Puyi to work at the Beijing Botanical Garden. His duties were modest, involving plants and basic gardening responsibilities rather than political decisions or ceremonial appearances. State accounts presented this employment as evidence of his successful transformation from emperor into productive citizen. The work also exposed how dependent his earlier life had been. Puyi had grown up without learning many ordinary tasks because palace servants had managed nearly every detail of his existence. One of the most striking episodes of his later life was his return to the Forbidden City as a visitor. The former imperial residence was now the Palace Museum, open to anyone who purchased admission. Puyi walked through courtyards where officials had once bowed before him and entered halls that had once been closed to the public. Objects he had known as household possessions were displayed as historical artifacts. The palace had survived, but its meaning had changed completely. It belonged to national history rather than to the Aisin-Gioro family. Puyi later worked as an editor for an organization connected to the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. He assisted with historical and literary materials, placing him inside an institution that documented the past he had personally experienced. In 1964, he became a member of the conference's National Committee. This position did not restore political power, but it gave him a carefully defined public role as a former ruler who had accepted the new social order. His autobiography, commonly known in English as From Emperor to Citizen, was published during this period. The book described his childhood in the Forbidden City, his cooperation with Japan, his years as Emperor of Manchukuo, and his subsequent transformation. It became one of the most influential accounts of his life, although historians treat it cautiously. The text was produced within the political environment of the People's Republic and shaped with editorial assistance, meaning that it combined personal recollection with the official interpretation of his rehabilitation. In 1962, Puyi married Li Shuqian, a hospital nurse who had no connection to the former aristocracy. Their marriage represented another break with imperial tradition. His earlier marriages had been organized around dynastic expectations, court ceremony, and succession. This later relationship belonged to the life of a private citizen. Puyi never had children, so the direct imperial line ended with him, although other branches of the Aisin-Gioro clan continued through his siblings and extended relatives. Puyi's younger brother Puyi also returned to China and eventually resumed family life after years of separation. Other Aisin-Gioro descendants entered professions far removed from the imperial court, including education, medicine, art, scholarship, and public service. Some retained the family name, while others avoided emphasizing their aristocratic origins. The clan did not disappear, but it ceased to function as a political dynasty. Its members survived by becoming part of the society that had replaced their ancestral empire. Puyi died in Beijing on October 17, 1967, after a period of illness. He left no heir, no functioning court, and no serious movement seeking to restore him. His life had crossed almost every major transformation experienced by 20th century China: imperial collapse, Republican revolution, warlord fragmentation, Japanese expansion, global war, communist victory, and socialist reconstruction. Few historical figures had moved so dramatically from absolute ceremony to political powerlessness. The fate of Puyi and the Aisin-Gioro family reveals that dynasties rarely disappear at the moment an abdication document is signed. The Qing throne ended in 1912, but the imperial household survived inside the Forbidden City, attempted restoration, accepted Japanese sponsorship, and finally entered ordinary civilian life. What remained was not a hidden empire waiting to return, but a family forced to live beyond the institution that had defined it for centuries. If this journey through the final chapter of China's imperial family gave you a new perspective on history, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next documentary.